Hi, everyone. This is Ray, the Singing Talit, continuing the reading of Alfred Edersheim's Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, Chapter 10. Hi, everyone. This is Ray, the Singing Talit, continue. Once only, in the great silence which lies on the history of Christ's early life, is broken. That is to say, the silence on his life is broken one time. It is to record what took place on his first visit to the temple. What this meant even to the ordinary devout Jew may easily be imagined. Where life and religion were so intertwined, and both in such organic connection with the temple and the people of Israel, every thoughtful Israelite must have felt as if his real life were not in what was around him, but ran up into the grand unity of the people of God, and were compassed by the halo of its sanctity. To him it would have been true in the deepest sense that, so to speak, each Israelite was born in Zion, as assuredly all the well springs of his life were there, according to Psalm 87. That is, therefore, not merely the natural eagerness to see the city of their God and of their fathers, this glorious Jerusalem, nor yet the lawful enthusiasm, national or religious, which would kindle it at the thought of our feet standing within those gates, through which priests, prophets, and kings had passed, but far deeper feelings which would make glad when it was said, "Let us go into the house of Jehovah." There were not ruins to which precious memories clung, nor did the great hope seem to lie afar off, behind the evening mist, but glorious things were spoken of Zion, the city of God. In the past and in the near future, the thrones of David were to be set within her walls and amidst her palaces. So, the first thing he's trying to explain to us is how the city of Zion, the city on the hill that cannot be hidden, is the way that Yeshua described it. This great city existed as like a linchpin holding together the totality of the Jewish cultural identity. That is to say that the holy city contained the holy temple, and in that holy temple existed the whole reason for everything that there was around Judaism. Now, this temple no longer contained the Ark of the Covenant. Certain festivals could no longer be completed. For instance, the festival of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur could no longer be completed because there was no one there who could fulfill it, because without the Ark of the Covenant, the ceremony itself cannot be fulfilled. There's no way to go into the Holy of Holies and make the proper presentation when the Ark no longer exists, or at least it was no longer in the possession of the people. Most people believe it was lost during the time of Jeremiah, that he hid it when the Babylonians came in, but there are other beliefs that it was actually lost prior to that, and it was actually in possession of the Egyptians during the reign of King Josiah, when he tried to reclaim it from the Pharaoh of Egypt. Because the Pharaoh said specifically to Josiah, "Why are you impeding what I am trying to do? I'm going against the Assyrians because God has told me to do so," which suggested that God was speaking to the Egyptian king, telling him to go and defend Israel. Just things like that, things we can consider. But the fact of the matter is that this great and amazing edifice, which had been reconstructed by Herod, was in fact it in some ways it was a cultural idol. And in fact, when Yeshua came into the city, the first thing his disciples said to him was, "Isn't it amazing, these giant walls and this amazing temple?" And he's like, "Not one stone will be left standing on another." And it broke his heart to know it, because it really was the center of all Jewish identity. But that was going to change. In strict law, personal observances of the ordinances, and hence attendance on the feast in Jerusalem, devolved on a youth only when he was of age, that is to say, 13 years old. Then he became what was known as a son of the commandments, or of the Torah, and this is, of course, the term bar mitzvah. He was the son of the mitzvahs. But as a matter of fact, the legal age was in this respect anticipated by 2 years, or at least by one, according to Yoma 82a. And it was in accordance with this custom that on the first Pascha, after Yeshua had passed his 12th year, his parents took him with them, and their wont to go up to the temple. And he was in the company, took him with them in the company of the Nazarenes to Jerusalem. The text seems to indicate that it was there that they were wont to go up to the temple, and to mark that, although women were not bound to make such a personal appearance, Mary gladly availed herself of what seems to have been the directions of Hillel, followed also by other religious women mentioned in the rabbinical writings, to go up to the solemn sanctuaries of the services of the sanctuary. Politically, times had changed. The weak and wicked rule of Archelaus had lasted only 9 years, from 4 BC to 6 AD, when, in consequence of the charges against him, he was banished to Gaul. Judea, Samaria, and Idumea were now incorporated into Roman provinces of Syria under its governor or its legate. The special administration of that part of of Palestine was, however, entrusted to the procurator, whose ordinary residence was at Caesarea. It will be remembered that the Jews themselves had desired some such arrangement in the vain hope that, freed from the tyranny of the Herodians, they might enjoy the semi-independence of their brethren in the Grecian cities, but they found it otherwise. Their privileges were not secured to them. Their religious feelings and prejudices were constantly experienced, though perhaps not intentionally outraged, and their Sanhedrin shorn of its real power, though the Romans would probably not interfere in what might have been regarded as purely religious questions. Indeed, the very presence of the Roman power in Jerusalem was a constant offense, and must necessarily have issued in a life and death struggle. One of the first measures of the new legate of Syria, P. Sulpicius Cornelius, after confiscating the ill-gotten wealth of Archelaus, was to order a census in Palestine, with the view fixation on the taxation of the country. The popular excitement with which this called forth was due, probably not so much to the opposition of a principle, as that is to the consensus was regarded as the badge of servitude and incompatible with the theocratic character of Israel. Had a census been considered absolutely contrary to the law, the leading rabbis would never have submitted to it, nor would the popular resistance to the measure of Cornelius have been quelled by the representations of the high priest Joazar. But although through this influence the consensus was allowed to be taken, the popular agitation was not suppressed. Indeed, that movement formed part of the history of time, and not only affected the political and religious parties in the land, but must have presented to the mind of Yeshua himself, since, as it was shown, it had represented within him his own family circle. So we already know that a census of the people of Israel is considered pretty taboo among the Israelites, or the people that live in Palestine at that time. However, it was still done. Most likely, as we read before, it was done through a system that was probably administered by the Pharisees, in some sense, to prevent people from feeling like the Romans were taking a direct census of them, which would have, queued up memories of what the Most High had done when David had taken a census. It's like I said, it's typically considered taboo to count the people. It had only been done once without dire consequences, and that was when Moses had done it as instructed at the time. The ascension of Herod, misnamed the Great, marked a period in Jewish history which closed with the war of despair against Rome and the flames of Jerusalem and the temple. It gave rise to the appearance of what Josephus, despite his misinterpretation of them, rightly called a fourth party. Besides the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, that became known as the Nationalist Party. This is from his Antiquities. A deeper and more independent view of history of the times would perhaps lead us to regard the whole country as ranged either with or against that party. as regards expressed in its purest and simplest form, their watchword was, negatively, to call no human being their absolute Lord, positively, that God alone was to lead as absolute Lord. It was, in fact, a revival of the Maccabean movement, perhaps more fully in its national than in its religious aspect, although the two could scarcely be separated in Israel, and their motto also almost reads like that which, according to some, furnished the letters from which the name Maccabee was in fact composed. Mikobah Baalim Yahovah, who like thee among the gods, Yahovah, or Mikamoka. It is characteristic of these times and religious tendencies that their followers were no more called as before the Asadians or the Chasachim, the pious, but zealots, or by the Hebrew equivalent, Kohanim. The real home of this party was not Judea nor Jerusalem, but in the Galilee. So this sect of very nationalistic, very much remnant of the Maccabean revolt folks that come along. Some people say that Judas Maccabeus or Judas Iscariot was a part of this. His name basically means man of the city, but some people say it could also mean a dagger man or a man who was known for killing Roman soldiers in alleyways, because this nationalistic group was known for murdering Romans in the city. Quite other and indeed antagonistic tendencies prevailed in the stronghold of the Herodians, Sadducees, and Pharisees. Of the latter, only a small portion had any real sympathy with this national movement. Each party followed its own direction. The Essenes, absorbed in theosophic speculations, not intinged with Eastern mysticism, withdrew from all contact with the world and practiced the ascetic life. The Essenes are who the Dead Sea Scrolls were penned by. These are the people who lived near Qumran, who lived near the Dead Sea, in a place where there was most folks didn't live. With them, whatever individuals may have felt, no such movement could have originated, nor yet with the Herodians or the Barthosians, who combined strictly Pharisaic views with Herodian political partisanship, nor yet with the Sadducees, nor finally with the constituents of their bolt, the Rabbinist party of the school of Hillel, but the brace, free highlanders of Galilee, and the region across their glorious lake seem to have inherited the spirit of Jephthah from Judges 11, and to have treasured as their ideals, alas, often wrongly apprehended their own Elijah as descending in wild, shaggy garb from the mountains of Galilee. He did battle against all of the might of Ahab and Jezebel. Their enthusiasm could not be kindled by the logical subtleties of the schools, but their hearts burned within them for their God, their land, their people, their religion, and their freedom. So this is the idea of the zealot or the religious terrorist, a person who is willing to do whatever it takes to get your religious views pushed forth. And it's a theme that is commonly used to frighten people in America today. It was in Galilee, according that such wild, irregular resistance to Herod at the outset of his career as could be offered was originized by guerrilla bands. That means people who are out in the countryside, killing in the name of their god. Bands of men who would be out there robbing merchant caravans, killing folks on the roadside, which this is, of course, from the way that Judah Maccabee did business during the time of the Maccabean revolt, because it was really more or less a civil war between Jewish groups more than it was a Jewish versus Greek war. It was Jews who wanted to be more Greek versus Jews who wanted to be more conservative. Would that be the right way to say it? But who wanted to keep the traditions that had kept them alive for so long, as opposed to doing things in accordance with the way of the Greeks. It was in Galilee, accordingly, that such wild, irregular resistance to Herod at the outset of his career as could be offered was organized by guerrilla bands which traversed the country and owned one Ezekias as their leader. Although Josephus calls them robbers, a far different estimate of them was obtained in Jerusalem, where, as we remember, the Sanhedrin summoned Herod to answer for the execution of Ezekias. What followed is told in substantially the same manner, though with different form, and sometimes nomenclature by Josephus in his Antiquities, and in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 19a. The story has already been related in another connection. Suffice it to say that after the ascension of Herod, the Sanhedrin became a shadow of itself. It was packed with Sadducees and the priests of the king's nomination, and with the doctors of the canon law, whose only aim was to pursue in peace their subtleties, who had not, and from their contempt of the people, could not have any real sympathy with the nationalist aspirations, and whose ideal heavenly kingdom was a miraculously heaven instituted absolute rule of the rabbis. Accordingly, the national movement, as it afterwards developed, received neither the sympathy nor the support of the leading rabbis. Perhaps the most gross manifestation of this was exhibited shortly before the king of Jerusalem by R. Yochanan ben Sakai, the most renowned among its teachers. Almost unmoved, he had witnessed the portent of the opening of the temple doors by an unseen hand, which, as by interpretation of Zechariah 11:1, was purportedly regarded as betokening the speedy destruction that was to come. There is cynicism as well as want of sympathy in the story recorded by tradition that when, in the straits of famine during the siege, Yochanan saw people eagerly feasting on soup made from straw, and he scouted the idea of such a garrison resisting Vespasian, and immediately resolved to leave the city. In fact, he was distinctly evident that R. Yochanan had, that is to say, Rabbi Yochanan, had, as leader of the school of Hillel, used all his influence, although in vain, to pursue the people to submission to Rome. We can understand it how this school had taken so little interest in anything purely national. Generally, only one side of the character of Hillel has been presented by writers, and even this is greatly exaggerated language. His much lauded gentleness, peacefulness, and charity were rather negative than positive qualities. He was philosophic, a rabbi, whose real interest lay in a far off direction than that of the sympathy with the people, and whose motto seemed indeed to imply, quote, "We, the sages, are the people of God, but this people who do not know the law are cursed." A far deeper feeling of intense, though misguided earnestness pervaded the schools of Shammai. It was in the minority, but it sympathized with the aspirations of the people. It was not philosophic nor eclectic, but intensely national. It opposed all approach to or by strangers. It dealt harshly with proselytes, even the most distinguished, such as Achalias and Onkelos. It passed by first murdering a number of Hillelites who had come to the deliberate assembly 18 degrees, of which the object was to prevent all intercourse with Gentiles, and it furnished leaders of the supporters of the nationalist movement. So it literally, students of Hillel had been murdered by coming to an assembly of Shammai to decide how to keep Gentiles from being a part of their world. Hillel is known as the prince who was he was the head of the Sanhedrin in the sense that he was considered the judge who was to understand the heart or the soul or the spiritual meaning behind the law, while Shammai was the number two man, the vice president, whose job was to understand the actual letter of the law. And in understanding the letter of the law, they did great disservice to the idea of it bringing life by literally driving Gentiles out and creating walls of distinction that would keep the people of the world. It would, well, I mean, let's be honest. It kept the Jews from being the Or de Goyim, which is the light unto the Gentiles. It was preventing that from happening. We have marked the rise of the Nationalist Party in Galilee at the time of Herod's first appearance on the scene and learned how mercilessly he tried to suppress it, first by the execution of Ezekias and his adherents, and afterwards then he became king of Judea by the slaughter of the Sanhedrin. The consequence of this unsparing severity was to give rabbinism a different direction. The school of Hillel, which henceforth commanded the majority, were men of no political color, theological theorists, self seeking jurists, vain rather than ambitious. The minority represented the school of Shammai, who were nationalists. Defective and even false as both tendencies were, there was certainly more hope as regarded the kingdom of God of the nationalists than of the sophists and of the jurists. It was, of course, the policy of Herod to suppress all national aspirations. No one understood the meaning of Jewish nationalism as he did. No one ever opposed it so systematically. There was an infernal fitness, so to speak, in this the attempt to kill the king of the Jews among the infants of Jerusalem. The murder of the Sanhedrin, with the consequence of a new anti Messianic tendency of rabbinism, was one measure of that direction. This is to say that Herod understood so well how dangerous it was among the people to have any kind of concept of some new Messiah has come, that he did everything he could, even so much as to looking to kill this prophesied Messiah, who were the wise men who came from Babylon, most likely descendants of Daniel's school there, who came looking for the child who would be the Messiah, or who would be the King of the Jews. And he did everything he could to just stop that. He relentlessly and mercilessly went after anyone who tried to have a nationalistic view of how the Jews were to rule. The Jews were to be the power of Israel, and then they would rebuild the kingdom of David and all that. He was just like, no, 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 because all that's going to lead to is him losing his position of power as a friend of Caesar, which is what he was. It was Augustus Caesar who got him that position. And if he lost that position as friend to Caesar, then the Romans would just come down harder than they'd ever come down before. And of course, we see that later as Vespasian is sieging Jerusalem, and then later as first they burnt down the temple during the siege, and then it was, I can't remember which Caesar it was, but it was postulated that the Jews be allowed to rebuild their temple and to go back to having their worship. But that's when when Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba began their revolt, and when Bar Kokhba's revolt happened, that was it. The Romans were like, "This is it. This is done. When we get this guy out, we're going to make sure no Jew steps foot in this city again." Which is when the real hardcore diaspora began. It wasn't just the destruction of the temple. It was once the Bar Kokhba revolt was overturned and ended that they really made sure no Jew could step foot in that city again. No one understood the meaning of that nationalism like Herod. All right, let's see. The various appointments which Herod made to be the high priest and other. So he was literally choosing who was going to get to be the high priest. And yet it was not easy, even in those times, to deprive the pontificate of its power and influence. The high priest was still the representative of religious life, and he acted on all occasions. And this is something that the Greek kings knew as well, because what they did was that they did the choosing of a high priestly office too. It was bought via bribe, and if you were unable to pay that bribe, they would find someone who could. Didn't matter if you were actually of the Aaronic line, the family line, or not. I'm referring to the time when Jason had literally just boxed up the priesthood and took it into Egypt and created the temple at Leontopolis, which was the temple where the actual Aaronic high priest was ministering from when the Greeks were running Israel. And then shortly thereafter, you have the Maccabean revolt took place. Let's see. All right. So the high priest was still the head of religious life. He was essentially the king of Israel. High priest, there's a separation, but essentially he's like the king of Israel. In the minds of the people, he's the head honcho. The high priest was still the representative of the religious life of the people, considering that there was no Davidic king. And in fact, you got to remember that there hasn't even been a David line king. They had After the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean kings came in. Those are Levitical line kings who took over and created their own empire, of course, until they made deals with the Romans, and then the Romans took over. He acted on all occasions when the question under discussion was not one exclusively of the subtlety of the canon law, as the president of the Sanhedrin, in which indeed the members of the family had evidently a seat and a vote, according to Acts 4:6. The four families from which, with few exceptions, the high priest, however often changed, were chosen, absorbed the wealth and commanded the influence of a state endowed establishment. In its worst times, it was therefore for the utmost importance to make wise choice of the high priest, with the exception of the brief tenure of Aristobulus, the last of the Maccabees, whose appointment, too soon followed by his murder, was at the time a necessity. All the Herodians, high priests, were non Palestinians. Keener blow than this could not have been dealt to that of nationalism. So it's saying literally that the people who were being chosen to be high priests weren't even from Jerusalem, weren't even from Judea. They weren't even from what we think of today as Israel. They were outsiders from other lands, probably Jewish, but from places that they would have been born into a different lifestyle than to have this deep burning nationalistic sense of we got to take our land back, or we got to get rid of these Romans. We got to get a new Maccabee, to a new Judah Maccabee to help us defeat this enemy. When is our Messiah coming to kill off the Romans and bring us into a seat of power? The same contempt for the high priesthood characterized the brief reign of Archelaus. On his deathbed, Herod had appointed to the pontificate Joazar, a son of Boethius, the wealthy Alexandrian priest. So here we have a priest who had come from Alexandria, whose daughter, Miriam II, he had married. The Boethosian family, allied to Herod, formed a party known as the Herodians, who combined the strict Pharisaic views with the devotion to the reigning family. Joazar took the popular part against Archelaus on his ascension. For this he was deprived of his dignity in favor of another son of Boethius, Eleazar by name. But the mood of Archelaus was fickle. Perhaps he was distrustful of the family of Boethus. At any rate, Eleazar had to give place to Yeshua, the son of Sai, an otherwise unknown individual. At the time of the taxing Quirinius, we find Joazar again in office, according to the Antiquities, apparently restored to it by the multitude, which having taken matters into its own hands, at the time of the government, recalled one who had formerly favored national aspirations. It is thus that we explain his influence with the people in persuading them to submit to the Roman taxation. But Joazar had succeeded with this unthinking populace. He failed to conciliate the more advanced of his own party, and as the event proved, the Roman authorities also, whose favor he had hoped to gain. It will be remembered that the Nationalist Party, or that is called the Zealots, as they were afterwards called, first appeared in those guerrilla bands which traveled Galilee under the leadership of Ezekias, whom Herod had executed. But the National Party was not destroyed, it was only held in check during his iron reign. It was once more the family of Ezekias that headed the movement. During the civil war which followed the ascension of Archelaus, or rather was carried on while he was pleading his cause in Rome, the standard of the nationalists was again raised in Galilee. Judas, the son of Ezekias, took possession of the city of Sepphoris and armed his fellows from the royal arsenal there. At the time, as we know, the high priest Joazar sympathized, at least indirectly, with the nationalists. The rising, which indeed was generally throughout Palestine, was suppressed by fire and sword, and the sons of Herod were enabled to enter on their possession. But when, after the disposition of Archelaus, Joazar persuaded the people to submit to the taxation of Quirinius, Judas was not disposed to follow what he regarded as the treacherous lead of the pontiff. In conjunction with the Shammite Rabbi Sadduq, he raised again a standard revolt although once more unsuccessful, according to the Antiquities. How the Hillelites looked upon this movement, we gather even from the sightings of the allusions of Gamaliel in Acts 5:37. The family of Ezekiel furnished other martyrs to the national cause. The two sons of Judas died for it on the cross in 46 AD. Yet a third son, Manahem, who from the commencement of the war against Rome was one of the leaders of the most fanatical nationalists, the Saccari, or the Jacobins of the party, as they have been aptly designated, died under unspeakable sufferings. This is from Josephus's Wars of the Jews. While a fourth member of the family of Eleazar was a leader of Israel's forlorn hope and nobly died at Masada in the closing drama of the Jewish War of Independence. On such stuff were the Galilean zealots made. But we have to take this intense nationalist tendency also into account in the Jewish history of Yeshua, the more so that at least one of his disciples, that is to say, a member of his family, had at one time belonged to the party. Only the kingdom of which Yeshua was the king was, he himself said, not of this world, and of far different conception from that which was of the nationalists and what they had longed for. At the time when Yeshua went up to the feast, Quirinius was, as already stated, the governor of Syria. The taxing and the raising of Judas was alike past, and the Roman governor, dissatisfied with the trimming of Joazar and the distrust of him, had appointed in his stead Anonus, the son of Seth, the Annas of infamous memory in the New Testament. With brief interruption, he and his son held the political office till, under the procuratorship of Pilate, Caiaphas, the son of Annas, succeeded to that dignity. It has already been stated that the subject of the Roman governor in Syria, the rule of Palestine devolved onto that of the procurator, of whom Coponius was the first. Of him and his immediate successors, Marcus Ambivius, Annius Rufus, and Valerius Gratus, we may know little. They were indeed guilty of a most grievous fiscal oppression, but they seem to have respected, so far as it was in them, the religious feelings of the Jews. We know that they had even removed the image of the emperor from the standards of the Roman soldiers before marching them into Jerusalem. Now that's surprising. So as to avoid the appearance of the cultus of the Caesars. So they didn't even want them to think of them as being in the cult or in the worship of the Caesar. It was reserved for Pontius Pilate to force this hated emblem on the Jews, and otherwise to set their most sacred feelings at defiance. But we may notice, even at this date, what with this critical period in Jewish history, the public appearance of Christ had synchronized. His first visit to the temple followed upon the Roman possession of Judea, the taxing, and the national rising, as also the institution of Annas to the priesthood, and the commencement of his public ministry was the contemporaneous with the ascension of Pilate and the institution of Caiaphas. Whether viewed subjectively or objectively, these things also have a deep bearing upon the history of Christ. So we're learning a tremendous amount about everything politically that was going on at the time that Yeshua was beginning his ministry in Israel. And there was a tremendous amount of infighting, a tremendous groups against groups, the Pharisees against the Pharisees in the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, and the not just political differences, but literally where a few Hillites ended up being killed for being at a place that they weren't invited to by the school of Shammai. This is surprising, but there was a tremendous amount of internal conflict that was happening at this time. It was not peaceful. When we read the New Testament, we kind of think of everything as being quiet and calm, and it's just a bunch of poor, we watch these movies and we see a bunch of poor people in rags walking around trying to get fish to eat and bread to eat. But really, there's fabulous wealth, in certain classes of people, and of incredible wealth into the temple and being brought in from the outside. And you have people who live their entire lives and just devoted to study, people who live their lives and as the poor, working poor, who have to slave away every day. And you got people who live the bourgeois lifestyle where they never have to work at all. And you got just a tremendous division philosophically of, should we be taking control of the actual land and returning it to who we are, or should we allow Rome to rule and work with the ruling parties of Rome? Because, of course, if you look in Daniel, you see that the diaspora would be ruled over, that Israel would be ruled over by these certain animals or these beasts of the world. And that must have been present in the minds of people at the time, and then especially among the Pharisees, who probably would have been like, look, there's no point in kicking against the pricks. There's no point in trying to fight these governments. Why don't we just let them rule and work with them, and we'll study the Torah and we'll do what we're supposed to do, and these governments can guard us and protect us like they're supposed to do. And of course, other people would have been like, I hate these oppressive Romans. I want them out, because we're God's chosen people and we're supposed to have dominion and power over everything, which of course you see that in the church too. There's people who think that the church is all about dominion and power, name it and claim it. I can have whatever I want. I'm the king's kids. I'm built to be in charge. I'm not built to be a servant. And yet, of course, what does Christ say to us? The greatest servant is the one who is in charge. If you want to be lifted up, you got to humble yourself. He does the lifting up. And it was, as we reckon it, the spring of 89 that Yeshua for the first time went up to the Paschal feast in Jerusalem. Coponius would be the pure curator at that time, and Annas ruled in the temple of the high priest. When he appeared among its doctors, but far other than political thoughts must have occupied the mind of Yeshua. Indeed, for a time, a brief calm had fallen upon the land. There was nothing to provoke active resistance, and the party of the zealots, although existing and striking deeper into the roots and the hearts of the people, was for the time rather what Josephus had called a philosophical party, their minds busy with the ideal, which their hands were not yet prepared to make a reality. And so, when according to the ancient wont of Psalm 42 or Isaiah 30, the festive company from Nazareth, soon swelled by other festive bands, went up to Jerusalem, chanting by the way of the Erith, soon swelled with the Psalm of the Ascent, which is Psalm 120 through 134, or called the degrees. To the accompaniment of the flute, they might have implicitly yielded themselves to the spiritual thoughts kindled by such words. When the pilgrims' feet stood within the gates of Jerusalem, there could have been no difficulty in finding hospitality. However crowded the city might have been on the occasion, it was known that people would hang draperies or they'd hang a sheet out on their porch to let people know, we got room you can stay in. Come to the feast. Come stay at our house. Come visit with us. Let us treat you and your family. It was a time of open doors. I'm talking like it's family reunion time, and everybody is glad to see everybody else. I personally have tasted little bits and little glimpses of this, experiencing Sukkot with other folks. And let me tell you that I know that there can be nothing on earth as blessed as the time of the tabernacles in Jerusalem. And I can't wait to the day that I get to experience that firsthand, and that I get to let my children experience it firsthand. For now, like I said, I've Succoted with, maybe a total of maximum 300 other people, including children who make up a large portion of a group. When it is a messianic type of group, there tends to be a lot of kids around. But I've tasted little glimpses, little bits, but I know that what he's describing here is an amazing time when houses were opened to strangers, because when it comes to being in the family of God, there are no strangers. And I mean, there's just absolutely no fear. Any observant Jew who would come was welcomed in. And you can imagine that lifelong friendships are being made. This is a time when people would have been trading. This is a time when people would have been talking, feasting, sharing, experiencing religious life. And not just religiously, because you can imagine it's sort of like summer camp. You see people you haven't probably seen in a year, if not 6 months. but at least a year, let's say, who were returning and wanted to say, "Hey, can I stay with you again like we did last year?" And our families can mingle together. And I'm sure that they were setting up daughters and sons and for marriage later and all that kind of stuff. When the pilgrims' feet stood at the gates of Jerusalem, there could have been no difficulty finding hospitality, however crowded the city may have seemed on such an occasion. Then more so we then remember the extreme simplicity of the Eastern manners and wants, and the abundance of provisions with which many sacrifices of this season would supply. But in this subject also, the evangelic narrative keeps silence. The glorious as a view of Jerusalem must have been, and seeming to a child coming from so far away from the retirement of a Galilean village. In other words, to say, when you got to Jerusalem and you saw that temple, because you could definitely see it from a distance, that city on a hill, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, when you could see it from a distance, lit up because they had huge torches that they set up in the courtyard of the temple and they'd burn all night long. I mean, basically, it's like in a modern football or baseball stadium, you'll have these big lights, these halogens that are just blaring down light. Well, they set up huge menorahs that just had fire blazing on the top of them, just for people to be able to see what was going on all throughout the city. The glorious view for a child coming from a Galilean village. We must bear in mind that he who now looked upon it was not any ordinary child, nor we perhaps mistaken in the idea that the sight of this grandiose world, as on any occasion, Luke 19, awoke in him not so much to the feelings of admiration, which had which might have been akin to those of pride, as of sadness, though they might not yet have been scarcely conscious of its deeper reason. But the one all engrossing thought would be of the temple. This, his first visit to its halls, seems almost to have called out to the first outspoken, and may not yet have inferred the first conscious thought of the temple as a house of his father, and with it the first conscious impulse of his mission and being. Here also it would have been a higher meaning rather than the structure and appearance of the temple that would absorb the mind, and yet there be sufficient even in the latter to enkindle enthusiasm, as the pilgrim ascended the mount, crested by that symmetrically proportioned building, which could hold in its gigantic girdle not fewer than 210,000 persons. His wonderment, and this is to say that the courtyards around the temple could hold 210,000 people just crammed in there, shoulder to shoulder, slaying and singing. I mean, I watched a video on Facebook from Sukkot at the Wailing Wall of Jews in their thousands, shoulder to shoulder, swaying and singing the psalms. It's hard to imagine that. His wonder might well increase at every step. The mount itself seemed like an island, abruptly rising out of the deep valleys, surrounded by a sea of walls, palaces, streets, and houses, crowned by a mass of snowy marble and glittering gold, rising terraces upon terrace. Although it measured a square of about 1,000 feet, or to give a more exact equivalent of the measurement furnished by the rabbis, 227 feet. Its most northwestern angle connected it, and it frowned on the castle of Antonia, held by the Roman garrison. The lofty walls were ooh, that is to say the tower, the keep of Antonia. That's where the Roman soldiers would just watch what happened in the temple court, so they could run down right out of the castle of Antonia, right out into the courtyard and grab people if they needed to. Which is very interesting that they did not grab Yeshua when he overturned the tables of the money changers, which would have been pretty offensive to the group that was there with him. And yet the Roman soldiers did nothing at the time, nor did the Herodians. Nobody came out there and stopped him. The lofty walls were pierced by massive gates. The unused gate, called Tadi, on the north, the Susa gate on the east, which opened on the roadway of the Mount of Olives, the two so-called Hulda, or probably Weasel gates, which led by the tunnels from the priest suburb of Ophel into the outer court, and finally the four gates on the west. Within the gates ran all around covered double colonnades, with here and there benches of those who resorted thither on for prayer or for a conference. The most magnificent of those was the southern, or the twofold double colonnade with its wide space between. The most venerable, the ancient, quote, Solomon's ports, unquote, or the eastern colonnade, and entering from the Zystius bridge under the Tower of John, according to Josephus's Wars, one would pass along the southern colonnade over the tunnel of the Holdy Gates to its eastern extremity, over which another tower rose, probably the pinnacle of the history of the temptation. To say that's probably the place where the high place at the temple that Christ was taken to, where he could oversee the city. Over which another tower rose, probably the pinnacle. From this height yawned the Kedron Valley, 450 feet below. From the lofty pinnacle, the priest each morning watched and announced the earliest streak of day. Passing along the eastern colonnade of Solomon's porch, we would, if the description of the rabbis is trustworthy, have reached the Susa gate, the carved representation of what the city over the gateway was a reminding of the eastern dispersion. Here, the standard measures of the temple were said to have been kept. Here also we have to locate the first and the lowest of the three Sanhedrins, which, according to the Mishnah of Sanhedrin 11:2, held their meetings in the temple. The second, the intermediate court of appeal, being the court of the priests, probably close to the Nicanor gate, and the highest, that of the great Sanhedrin, or the one-time hall of the hewn squared stones, Lishkath Hagazit. That was what they called the place where the high court, what we call it, the Supreme Court of the Pharisees, or not Pharisees, of the Sanhedrin met there. Passing out of this colonnade or fortress, we enter the court of the Gentiles, or what the rabbis call the Mount of the House, which was the widest on the west side and more narrow, respectively, on the east, the south, and the north. This was called the Chol, or the profane place to which Gentiles had access. Here must have been marked the sale of the sacrificial animals, the tables of the money changers, and the places from which the sale of other needful articles took place. Advancing within this court, you reach the low breast wall, which marked the space beyond which no Gentile nor the Levitically unclean person might proceed. Tablets bearing inscriptions to that effect, warning them that if upon 13 openings admitted into the inner court, thence 13 or 14 steps led up to the shale or the terrace, which was bounded by the wall of the temple buildings in a stricter sense. A flight of steps led up to the massive, splendid gates. The two on the west side seem to have been of no importance, so far as the worshippers were concerned, and probably intended for use of workmen. North and south gates were 4 gates, but the most splendid gate was that of the east, termed the Beautiful Gate of Acts 3:2. Entering by the latter, you came into the court of the women, so called because the women occupied it in 2 elevated and separated galleries, which, however, filled only part of the court. 15 steps led up to the upper court, which was bounded by a wall, and where the celebrated Nicanor gate, covered with Corinthian brass, here the Levites who conducted the musical part of the service were placed. In the court of the women were the treasury and the 13 trumpets, while at each corner were chambered walls and halls. When it says trumpets, it's the place where you drop in money that was shaped like a trumpet. Who conducted the musical part of the service, right? The upper court was divided into 2 parts by a boundary, the narrow part forming the court of Israel and the wider that of the priests, in which were, of course, the great altar and lever. The sanctuary itself was a higher terrace than the court of the priests. 12 steps led up to its ports, which extended beyond it on either side, north and south. Here, in separate chambers, all that was necessary for the sacrificial service was kept. On 2 marble tables near the entrance, the old showbread was taken out, and the new was brought in, where respectively placed. The porch was adorned by votive presents, conspicuous among them a massive golden vine. A two-leafed gate opened into the sanctuary itself, which was divided into two parts. The holy place had the golden candlestick, the table of showbread, and the golden altar of incense between them. The heavy double veiled concealed the entrance of the holy place, which in the second temple was empty, nothing being there but a piece of rock, called the Eben Shetiyah, or the foundation stone, which, according to tradition, covered the mouth of the pit on which it was thought the world was founded. Nor does all this convey an adequate idea of the vastness of the temple buildings. For all around the sanctuary and each of its courts were various chambers and outbuildings, which served different purposes connected with the services of the temple. It always strikes me as odd that people try to mark, if you really believe that there was a cataclysmic flood all across the earth, as high as the highest mountain, you can only imagine the churning and whirling and resettling of everything that occurred during that. And the separating out and the resorting of it, just literally the whole face of the earth. And yet someone says, "Oh, but here's the spot where it all began. In this hole is where it all began." Or, "Oh, here's the graves of Adam and Eve." In some part of this temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions, we must look for the child Yeshua on the third and the second following days of the feast, on which he first visited the sanctuary. Only on the first 2 days of the feast of Passover was a personal attendance in the temple necessary. With the third day commenced the so called half holidays, when it was lawful to return to one's home, a provision of which no doubt many availed themselves. Indeed, there was really nothing of special interest to detain the pilgrims, for the Passover had been eaten, and the festive sacrifices were offered, and the first ripe barley reaped and brought to the temple and waved. So we've had the feast of first fruits. They've eaten the Passover meal. They've made the sacrificial offerings. The the offering of the first fruits has been made. So now you enter a time when you could return home and then come back later, right? At the end of the week, come back later. And waved at the omer of the first flower before the Lord. Hence, in view of a well-known rabbinic provision, the expression of the gospel narrative concerning the parents of Jesus when they had fulfilled the days, Luke 2:43, cannot necessarily imply that Joseph and the mother of Jesus had maintained in Jerusalem during the whole Paschal week. On the other hand, the circumstances connected with the presence of Yeshua in the temple render this supposition impossible. For Yeshua could not have been among the doctors after the close of the feast. The first question here is as to the locality in the temple where the scene had been laid. It has indeed been commonly supposed that there was a synagogue in the temple, but of this there is, at least to say, no historical evidence. But even if such had existed, the worship and the addresses of the synagogue would not have offered any opportunity for the questioning on the part of Yeshua, which the narrative implies. Still more groundless is the idea that there was in the temple something like a Bet HaMidrash, or a theological academy, not to speak of the circumstances that a child of 12 would not at any time have been allowed to take part in its discussions. But there were occasions on which the temple became virtually, though not formally, a Bet Ha Midrash, for we have read in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 88b that the members of the temple Sanhedrin, who on ordinary days sat at the court of appeal from the close of the morning to the time of the evening sacrifice, were wont on Shabbat and the feast days to come out upon the terrace of the temple where they would teach. In such popular instruction, the utmost latitude of questioning would be given, as it is with this audience, which sat on the ground surrounding the mingling of the doctors. Hence, during that time, and not after the feast, there we must imagine to see the child Yeshua. So he's trying to give us an idea of when it probably occurred that Yeshua was at the temple. Then there were certain days, like on the Sabbath or on certain holy feast days, that the guys or these the priests who would sit in the mid court of the Sanhedrin would go out and talk to people and discuss things with folks who were interested in learning more on the temple terrace, and that's probably where it occurred at. But we have yet to show that the presence of the questioning of the child of that age did not necessarily imply anything so extraordinary as to convey the idea of a supernaturalness to those doctors or others in attendance. Jewish tradition gives other instances, later arrangements, not only in Babylon but in Palestine. There were two kinds of public lectures and two kinds of students. The first, or the more scientific class, was designated the Khalah, or literally the bride, and its attendants were called Beni Kala, or children of the bride. These lectures were delivered, remember these terms, by the way. Kala, the bride. The bride of Christ, right? And the attendants were called the children of the bride. These lectures were delivered in the last month of the summer of Elul, before the feast of the new year, and in the midwinter month of Adar, immediately before the feast of Passover. They implied considerable preparation on the part of the lecturing rabbis and at least some Talmudic knowledge on the part of the attendants. On the other hand, there were students of the court of the Chatshata, or the Babylonian Tarbitza, who, during ordinary lectures, sat separated from the regular students by a kind of hedge, outside, as it were, in the court, some of whom seemed to have been ignorant even of the Bible. The lectures addressed to such a general audience would, of course, be of a very different character. But if there was nothing so unprecedented as to render his presence and questioning marvelous, yet all who had heard him were amazed as to his combinative insight and discerning answers. We scarcely ventured to inquire towards what his questions had been, or to whom they had been directed. Judging by what we know of such discussions, we infer that they may have been connected with the Paschal ceremonies. The grave Paschal questions did arise. Indeed, the great Hillel obtained his rank as a chief when he proved to the assembled doctors that the Passover might be offered even on the Shabbat. Many other questions might arise on the subject of Passover. Or did the child Yeshua, as afterwards in his connection with the messianic teachings, lead up by his questions to the deeper meaning of the Paschal ceremonies, as it was to be unfolded when he himself was to be offered up, a Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world? Other questions also force themselves on the mind, most notably this: whether on occasion of this his first visit to the temple, the the Virgin Mother had told her son the history of his infancy and of what had happened when, for the first time, he had been brought to the temple. It would also seem, if we might judge from the contrast between the Virgin Mother complaint about the search of his father and her son, his own emphatic appeal to the business of his father, but most surprising, truly wonderful, is what must have been seemed to Joseph and even to the mother of Jesus, that the meek, quiet child should have been found in such good company, and so engaged as it must have been quite other than what, from his past, they would have expected, or they would have not have taken for granted when they left Jerusalem, that he was among their kinsfolk in a acquaintance, perhaps, with the mingling of the children. Nor yet would they, in such a case, after they had missed him for the first night's halt at Shechem, this is according to Josephus's Antiquities, if the direct road north through Samaria was taken, according to the Mishnah at Arkaboth, have so anxiously sought him by the way. And Jerusalem, nor yet would have seemed to have been amazed when they found him in the assembly of the doctors. The reply of Yeshua to the half reproachful, half relieved expostulation of them would have sought him sorrowing these 3 days, and sets clearly these three things before us. He had been so entirely absorbed by the awakening thought of his being and his mission, however kindled, as to be not only neglectful but forgetful all around. Nay, it even seemed to him impossible to have understood how they could have sought him and not known where he would have been. Secondly, we may venture to say that he now realized that this was emphatically his father's house. And thirdly, so far as we can judge it, was then there that for the first time he felt the strong and irresistible impulse, that divine necessity of his being to be, quote, about his father's business, unquote. We all, when first awakening to spiritual consciousness, or perhaps when first time taking part in the feast of the Lord's house, may, and learning from his example, should make this hour of decision in which the life shall be wholly consecrated to the business of our Father. But there was far more than this in the bearing of Christ on this occasion. The forgetfulness of his child life was a sacrifice of self, that entire absorption in his Father's business without a thought of himself, either in his self gratification of curiosity or the acquisition of knowledge of a personal ambition, a consecration of himself unto God, in his first manifestation of his passive and active obedience to the will of God. Even at this stage, it was his fourth bursting of his inmost meaning of his life. Quote, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work, unquote. And yet his awakening of Christ's consciousness on his first visit to the temple, partial and perhaps even temporary as it may have been, seemed itself like the morning dawn, which from the pinnacle of the temple of the priest watched ere he summoned his waiting brethren beneath to offer the early sacrifice. So he's making a lot of assumptions, but it's okay. He's painting a picture of Christ as a divine entity that is becoming awoke and expanded as he stands amongst the temple and amongst the learned scholars of the temple. Um, I personally tend to feel that a lot of children his age would have been, absolutely astounded and amazed and would have been absorbed. I mean, I, as a child, would have probably done the same thing. I would have wanted to hear the great teachers speak, and I would have wanted to been at the amazing temple, since honestly, it's about the only super awesome building that I would have had access to. I mean, it's not like I could go to Caesarea Philippi to the house of the Pontius Pilate or the procurate or anything like that. Herod built some amazing buildings and structures, but they didn't have religious significance. But the temple had tremendous significance to the people. From what we know already, learned of this history, we do not wonder what this answer of Jesus came to his parents as a fresh surprise, for we can only understand that we perceive it in its totality. But here each fresh manifestation came as something separate and new, not as a part of the whole. Now, you ought to remember, too, that when they came back and found him, I think it's pretty clearly implied that they're like, you can't do this again. And I believe that he, in obedience to the commandment, would have obeyed his parents. He would have said, okay, no problem. I'm sorry. I would assume he would have apologized and said, I'm sorry. I didn't know this was a problem, because he thought he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. But obedience to your parents is first and foremost. And therefore, as a surprise of which of the purport of the meaning could not be understood except in its organic connection as to the whole. And for the true human development of the God man, what was the natural was also the needful process, even as it had best been learned from Mary herself, and for the future reception of his teaching. These three subsidiary reasons may once more be indicated here in explanation of the Virgin Mary seeming ignorant of her son's true character. The necessary gradualness of such a revelation, the necessary development of his own consciousness in the fact that Yeshua could have been subject to his parents, nor had true and proper human training, if there had clearly been known he was the essential Son of God. Let me tell you, just because she had a vision 12 years, well, be probably almost 13 years prior, it's hard for a human to hold on to a memory that long. Let me tell you, I have had some amazing experiences in this walk, but I cannot even remember them all. I have forgotten some. I wrote a lot of them down and put them in my testimony on my website so that I would not forget them, so that I could go back and review them and relive those memories. because when you just have to hold on to something, and I'm assuming that Mary may not even have been literate. I truly don't know if Mary or Joseph were literate or not. I mean, I guess somebody taught Yeshua how to read, but let's just say Mary was illiterate, and how would she be able even to write down her memories, to hold on to them, especially at a time when, I mean, there's not paper and pencil. You'd have had to get something and write on it and make it permanent. They did have wax tablets that students wrote on. They probably had, I'm sure they probably knew how to make clay, but that seems like a hard way to retain a memory. My point is being, who's to say that she could even remember well what had been said to her, or even the dad. They've been living with this kid for 12 years, raising him up, worrying about family. They had other children too, I'm assuming, since we see quote unquote James or Yochanan being the brother of Yeshua in the writings of in the New Testament. So they probably had other kids. They had a lot of their family to raise. They got other memories they're making. It can be easy to forget that, hey, there had been this, big thing. I mean, they might not forget that he was a miracle baby for sure. But then again, I call my daughter a miracle baby too, because my wife was supposed to never be able to get pregnant, and yet she did. So I mean, it can be hard to remember how spiritual and powerful a calling God may have on a child's life when you're raising that kid and say, hey, stay in line, because I got to keep up with you, and I got to keep up with your brothers and your sisters. So stay where you're supposed to be, because you're supposed to be helping me watch them. Further, though, to us, it seems a downward step was his quiet, immediate, unquestioning return to Nazareth to his parents, because he obeyed them, and his willing submission to them while there. It was a self denial, self sacrifice, self consecration to his mission, with all that it implied. It was not self examination, but self submission. Wow, I've never even seen that word before. But self submission, all of the more glorious in proportion to the greatness of that self. This constant contrast before his eyes only deepened in the heart of Mary the ever present impression of all those matters of which she was the most cognizant. She was learning to spell out the word Messiah, as each of these matters of thought taught her one fresh letter in it, and she looked at them all in the light of the Nazareth son. Wow, what a extreme paragraph to paint this one picture. He's saying basically that Mary was beginning to come to realize that her son really was the Messiah, really was this promised entity, this promised being, this promised person who would save Israel from itself. Well, I'm sorry, save Israel from its enemies, but really the biggest enemy is the self. That's kind of always been the problem, right? With his return to Nazareth began Yeshua's life as a youth and the early manhood. I also like to point out that Yeshua clearly obeyed the fifth commandment, and he's not just saying that he, as a son of the commandments, would have obeyed the fifth commandment, which is to honor your father and mother. If your father and mother give you an order, you better do it. Okay. On his return to his Nazareth life, Jesus began as a youth in the early manhood, with all the inward and outward development of heavenly and earthly approbation which it carried. This is according to Luke 5:52. Whether or not he went on to Jerusalem on recurring feasts, we do not know, and need not inquire. For only once during that period, on his first visit to the temple and the awakening of his youth life, could there have been such an outward forth bursting of his well-being and mission. Other influences were at their silent work to weld his inward and outward development and to determine the manner of his later manifestation of himself. We assume that the school education of Jesus must have ceased soon after his return to Nazareth. Henceforth, the Nazareth influences of his life and thinking of Jesus may be grouped, and progressively, as he advanced from his youth to manhood, under these peculiars of a home, quote, comma, nature, and prevailing ideas. Remember, too, that Nazareth was a city where people who were under a Nazarite vow would have taken like a vacation, because there was a priestly detachment there that was assigned to help people and to minister to the people there. So it's very likely that he was constantly exposed to the priesthood and to people who were under the Nazarite vow. Home. Jewish home life, especially in the country, was of the simplest form. Even in a luxurious city like Alexandria, it seemed often to have been such, alike as a regard the furnishings of the house and the provisioning of the table. The morning and the midday meal must have been of the plainest, and even largely the evening meal was the simplest in the home of a person of Nazareth. Only on the Shabbat and on festivals, whether domestic or public, brought what the best lay within reach. But Nazareth was not a city of the wealthy or influential, and such festive evening entertainments with elaborate and ceremoniousness of reception, arrangements of guests and occurring the rank, the rich spread abroad, would but rarely, if ever, be witnessed in these quiet homes. The same simplicity would prevail in the dress and the manners. But close and loving were the bonds which drew together the members of a family. The deep influence which they exercised on each other we cannot here discuss. The vexed question whether the brothers and sisters of Jesus were such in the real sense, or step brothers or sisters, or else cousins, though it seemed to us to be of a primary meaning of the terms, which would scarcely have been called into question, but for a theory of false asceticism and undervaluing of the sanctity of the married state. But whatever the precise relationship between Jesus and these brothers and sisters, it must have been on any theory could have been of the closest and exercised its influence upon him. So he's saying that his brothers and sisters were a part of his life and probably influenced him. Passing over Yoses of Joseph, or whose history we know next to nothing of, we have sufficient materials to enable us to form some judgment on what must have been the tendencies of those thoughts of the two brothers, James and Jude, before they were heart and soul followers of Messiah, and of his cousin Simon. If we might venture on a general characterization, we would infer from the epistle of St. James that his religious views had originally been cast in the mold of Shammai. Certainly, there is nothing of a Hillite direction about it. You read James. James, like, you want to know what my faith is? Look at what I do. I do what I do because of my faith. My faith is what causes my action. Faith is not what you think. Faith is what you do, and that's James' idea. It's an expression of both. You were internal. You externally do what you internally have inside yourself, and that's the immunah. That's the faith, which is that's a pretty Jewish, deeply hardcore idea concept. Of Simon, we know that he belonged to the Nationalist Party, since he is expressly so designated among the Zealots in Luke 6. Lastly, there is an epistle of St. Jude, one undoubted and another probable reference of the two to those pseudepigraphal and apocryphal works, which at this time marked one deeply interesting phase of the messianic outlook of Israel. He quotes the book of Enoch. He quotes the Watchers in the book of Enoch. We have thus marked one deeply interesting phase of the messianic outlook of Israel. We have thus, within the narrow circle of Christ's family life, not to speak of any intercourse with the sons of Zebedee, who probably were also his cousins, and the three most hopeful and pure Jewish tendencies, brought into contact with Jesus in Pharisaism, the teachings of Shammai, then the nationalist idea, and finally the hope of the glorious messianic figure. To these there should probably be added at least knowledge of the lonely preparation of his kinsman John, who, though certainly not in a scene, had, from the necessity of his calling, much in his outward bearing that of an akin to them, because he lived outside of the city. John the Baptist, Yochanan the Immerser, as some people say. Um, John, who lived there in Bethany, who was baptizing people as they came in from the outside to cleanse them as they entered the holier part of the land, because they were about to ascend up to Jerusalem, and he cleansed them before they ascended to Jerusalem. But we are anticipating from what are necessarily only suggestions. We turn again to what is certain in connection with his family life and its influences. From Mark 6, we may infer with great probability, though not with absolute certainty, that he had adopted the grace of Joseph. I'm not sure exactly what it means to adopt somebody's grace. Among the Jews, the contempt for manual labor. Oh, that's it. which was one of the painful characteristics of heathenism, did not exist. On the contrary, it was deemed a religious duty, frequently and most earnestly insisted upon, to learn some trade, provided it did not minister to luxury nor tend to lead away from personal observance of the law. That's from two Talmudic writings. There was not such separation between the rich and poor as with us. While wealth might confer social distinction, the absence of it was in no way implied to be a social inferiority. Nor could it have been otherwise where wants were so few, life was so simple, and its highest aim so ever present in mind. We have already spoken of the religious influences in the family, so blessedly different from the neglect, exposure, and even murder of children among the heathen, or their education by slaves who corrupted the mind from the earliest opening. The love of parents to children appearing even in the curse which was felt to attach to childlessness, the reverence towards parents as a duty higher than any of the outward observance, and the love of brethren, which Yeshua had learned from his home. Let me tell you something. They refer to the curse of childlessness. It is a curse to not have children. If God want, even among ultra orthodox communities today, if a wife cannot give a man, I believe it's 2 years. If a wife cannot give her husband a child within 2 years, the divorce is allowed, encouraged even, because you need to be with somebody you can have a child with. And if you can't have a child with this person, there's a problem. Then apparently it's a spiritual problem. Let me tell you, I had no idea that when I cried out for help from the Most High God, that He made the seed that I had placed in my wife take root. That was not supposed to be possible. It wasn't supposed to be possible. She was never supposed to be able to get pregnant, and yet she got pregnant, brought our child to term. She has never been pregnant again or brought another child to term since. But He made sure that we had one child to make sure that I would know this one day when I read what a curse it was among the Jews to be childless, that He would not let me be childless. They give us also an insight into the family life of Nazareth, and yet there is nothing somber nor morose about it. Even the joyous games of children, as well as festive gatherings of families, find their record in the words uh, and of the life of Christ. This also is characteristic of his past, and so are his deep sympathies with all sorrow and suffering, and his love for the family circle, as evidenced in the home of Lazarus, that he spoke Hebrew and used and quoted the scripture in its original has already been shown, although no doubt he understood Greek, even possibly Latin. Alfred Edersheim, right in the 1800s, will tell you that Christ spoke Hebrew. So yeah, he spoke Hebrew, and I'm sure he quoted it in the original Hebrew when he spoke it. Every scripture he said. Nature and everyday life. The most superficial pursuit of the teachings of Christ most convince how deeply sympathetic he was with nature and how keenly observant of man. Here there is no contrast between the love of country and the habitants of city life, and the two are found side by side. On his lonely walks he must have laid and had an eye for the beauty of the lilies of the field, and thought of it, and how the birds of the air receive their food upon an unseen hand, and with what maternal affection the hen gathered her chickens under her wings. These, of course, are all things he used in his parables when he taught. He had watched the sower or the vine dresser as they went forth about their labor, and read the teachings of the tares which sprang up from among the wheat. To him, the vocation of the shepherd must have been full of meaning, as it led and fed and watched its flock and spoke with his sheep with well known voice, brought them to the fold, or followed, or tenderly carried back those who had strayed, ever ready to defend them, even at the cost of his own life. Nay, he must have. He even seems to have watched the inhabitants of the fox in its lair, but he also equally knows the joys, the sorrows, the wants, the sufferings of the busy multitude, the play and the pay and the market, in the marriage processions and the funeral rites, and the wrongs of the unjust and the oppressed, the urgent harshness of the creditor, the bonds of the prisoner of the debt, the palaces and the luxuries of the princes and the courtiers, and the self-indulgence of the rich, and the avarice of the covetous, and the exactions of the tax gatherers, and the oppressions of the widow by the unjust judges. All these had made an indelible impression on his mind, and yet this evil world was not one which he had hated, he from which he would withdraw himself for his disciples, though ever and again he felt the need for periods of meditation and prayer. On the contrary, he had confronted all the evil that was in it. He would fain pervade the mass with a new leaven, not cast it away, but renew it. He recognized the good and hopeful, even in those in whom it seemed lost. He quenched not the dimly burning flax, nor braked the bruised reed. It was not contempt of the world, but sadness over it, not condemnation of man, but drawing him to his heavenly Father, not despising the little of the poor. I'm reading this, and all I can think of is how he had affected me when I was a child, and how I miss how I felt when I was a child about him. I was brave like that when I was a child. Now it's much harder. As an adult, it's much harder. Seems like it would be easier. The more you learn it, the more you repeat it. It's supposed to become easier, right? Together with keen insight and with the real under the mask of the apparent, and withering denunciation and unsparing exposure of all that was evil, mean, and unreal, wherefore it might appear. Such were some of the results gathered from his past, as presented in his teaching, of the prevailing ideas around which he was brought in contact. Some have already been mentioned. Surely the earnestness, that means to be humble, of his Shammai brother, that's a student of Shammai, if such may venture to designate him, the idea of the kingdom suggested by the nationalists, only in its purest and most spiritual form, as not in this world, and as truly releasing the sovereignty of realizing the sovereignty of the God in the individual, whoever he might be, even the dreamy thoughts of the prophetic literature in those times, which sought to read the mysteries of the coming of the kingdom, as well as the prophet like asceticism of his forerunner and kinsman, formed at least so many a point of contact in his teaching. Thus, Christ was in sympathy with all the highest tendencies of his people and time. Above all, there was his intimate converse with the scriptures of the Old Testament. If in synagogue he saw such he saw much to show the hollowness of the self-seeking pride and literalism which a mere external observance of the law foreshadowed or fostered. He would ever turn from what man or devil said to what he read to what was written. Not one dot or hook would fall away to the ground. All must be established and fulfilled. The law of Moses in all its bearing, the utterances of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Micah, Zechariah, Malachi, and the hopes and the consolations of the Psalms were all to him literally true, cast their light upon the building which Moses had reared. It was all one, a grand unity, not an exaggeration of different part, an aggregation of different parts, but the unfolding of a living organism. Chiefest of all, it was the thought of the messianic bearing of all Scripture to its unity, the idea of the kingdom of God and the King of Zion, with which was the life and light of all. Beyond this, into the mystery of his inner converse with God, the unfolding of his spiritual receptiveness, and the increasing communication from above, we dare not enter. Even with his bodily appearance may not have been seen, we scarcely venture to imagine. It could not but be that his outer man in some measure bodied forth his inner being, yet we dread gathering around our thoughts of him the artificial flowers of legend. What his manners and mode of receiving and dealing with men were, we can portray to ourselves in his life. And so it is best to remain content with the simple account of the evangelic narrative. Quote, Jesus increased in favor with God and with man. I can tell you exactly what it looks like. It looks like the man looking back at you in the mirror. That's what Christ looks like. If he is within you, then you look like him. That's why we don't have a description of what he looks like. That's why we don't need one. We don't need to know what this man looked like, because all we need to do is have him dwelling in us. by the words of the Most High God, the 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 God of creation dwells here in our cerebral cortex, where we actually make decisions. He sits enthroned in the corpus callosum, which joins the two cerebrum or cherubim of your brain together, wherein is his law and where he has put life. He's given you this little advantage, little difference between you and the animals, and where he put it there, that's where he sits. And if you allow him, he will rule your life and lead you to life and life more abundantly. Or you can try to do it your own way and find out that it's really just the animal in you that's driving you to everything. And don't get me wrong, it can be hard to defy that animal, because, like we see with Christ in the wilderness, he goes out there and he starts starving himself. He fasts, he cuts back all of his intakes, and he starts really feeling his body screaming at him to feed him. But let me tell you, as a person, I fasted once, 3 days, nothing but water. On that third day, I wasn't hungry anymore. I stopped being hungry. It was even weird to start eating again when I started eating again. Some switch inside my body had flipped, and I had moved from, I tell you, I was sitting at a buffet, drinking water, watching my family eat, and I was watching people shovel food in their mouths like pigs. And it was upsetting, because all I could think was, you really don't need to do that. You don't need that food. You don't need it, but you want it, because your body wants it. And the question is, can you overcome want? And when you allow the word to become what makes the decisions instead of you making the decisions, that's when you learn to overcome want. And that's what a lot of the Bible is really about, is learning how to overcome yourself. And that's why I say that when the Messiah came, of course, obviously everybody doesn't agree with me. I believe when the Messiah came, he came to save Israel from itself, because the bride needed to be taught so that the bride could function appropriately again, because the bride, which is Israel, could not overcome herself anymore. And even in the Torah, he warns us. He says, one day you'll become fat and slick and you'll forget about me. And when that happens, he's going to make himself known again in a very painful way, usually with famine. And when famine comes, suddenly you remember, oh no, I need you, I need you, I need you. So, with that being said, we've concluded a very long chapter of this book, and I thank you so much for staying with me throughout it. And well, next time I'll start doing live broadcasts, and hopefully people will chat. Didn't have any chat this time, but maybe next time. Thank you, and blessed be the Most High God, Jehovah Elohim, who has lifted up this us in this day, when we have so much privilege and so much wealth, so much understanding, and most importantly, so much communication, where we can talk to one another, share with one another his word, which he gave to us to understand how to be what he wanted us to be. Be blessed.